The winter of 1944 descended upon Europe like a silent executioner. The forests of Belgium and Luxembourg were trapped under a white blanket of snow so thick it swallowed sounds, erased tracks, and transformed the entire world into a cold, still, and treacherous landscape. Dark pine trunks stood like frozen spears, motionless before the biting winds that seemed to gnaw at the skin of anyone who dared to walk there. On the small rural roads, so narrow they could barely accommodate a truck, lines of Allied soldiers marched unhurriedly. Their footsteps crunched on the hardened snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A slow, lazy sound, almost overconfident. After all, everyone believed the war was practically won. The Nazi machine seemed broken, out of fuel, without trained soldiers, without hope. Every rumor said that Hitler was cornered, delirious in his bunker, unable to make any move that really mattered. The newspapers, the radio, and even the commanders repeated the same song. It's only a matter of time. And this thought, sweet and dangerously comfortable, spread through the American and British ranks. The Ardennes region, with its winding hills and mist-shrouded valleys, was treated almost as a rest area. Young, newly arrived divisions, still learning the smell of war, were placed there precisely for that reason. It was a calm place, a front where nothing happened, a place where veterans, frozen and exhausted, could catch their breath before the final march into Germany. But what no one knew, not even the most experienced generals, was that beneath that tranquil snow, the enemy was moving. Far from Allied eyes, hidden by the dense trees and the anticipatory darkness of winter, thousands of German soldiers stood motionless, watching, waiting. Their white coats blended into the ice, their rifles gleamed in the grey light of dawn. Engines were kept silent. Gigantic tanks lay concealed beneath camouflage nets and branches, like enormous predators awaiting the perfect moment to strike. The snow, which seemed to protect the Allies, actually concealed the greatest strategic deception on the Western Front. What began as a peaceful winter was about to turn into a white hell, where each shot would echo like thunder, and where men would freeze before they even bled. The calm was just an illusion. The storm, Germany's last and fiercest, was seconds away from exploding. Hitler prepares a desperate coup, extended version, as the icy winds of the 1944 winter swept through the dense forests of the Ardennes, carrying with them the distant whisper of a war that seemed to be drawing to a close. The American soldiers, huddled in their makeshift trenches, allowed themselves a glimpse of optimism. They imagined that the worst was over. The beaches of Normandy were distant. Paris had been liberated, and the Rhine, the great river that separated Germany from its inevitable ruin, seemed within reach of a final march. Just endure the biting cold, they thought, their numb fingers gripping rusty rifles and their stomachs rumbling for meager rations. Just wait for the spring sun to melt the snow, and with it, the last vestige of Nazi resistance. But oh, how illusory were these thoughts, how fragile as ice crystals under the weight of an enemy boot. For in the dark heart of Germany, where the shadows of the once Grand Reich writhed in agony, something very different was simmering. A plan born not of strategy, but from the abyss of utter despair. In Berlin, the once gleaming capital now reduced to a labyrinth of rubble and underground bunkers, Adolf Hitler, the Führer whose vision had once set an entire continent ablaze, now bent over tables overflowing with torn and yellowed maps. The reports that arrived were like successive stabs, catastrophic losses in the east, where the Soviet Red Army devoured entire divisions like a ravenous leviathan. In the west, the Allies advanced inexorably, with Eisenhower commanding a multinational force that seemed invincible. German cities, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, burned night after night under the relentless bombardment of British Lancasters and American B-17s, whose silver wings crisscrossed the skies like messengers of death. Factories that once roared with the sound of hammers forging Aryan destiny now stammered, paralyzed by the scarcity of slave labor, stolen raw materials and fuel that evaporated like smoke. The veteran soldiers, those heroes of 1940 who had trampled France in weeks, now lay in anonymous graves, buried in the Russian steppes, drowned in Dutch canals, or torn apart on Normandy beaches. What remained? An exhausted nation, a starving people, and a leader whose mind, corroded by paranoia and the amphetamines that kept him awake on endless nights, refused to accept surrender. But Hitler, in his visionary madness, saw not the end, but an opportunity, a last, desperate, hallucinatory gamble. He would not bow to the inevitable. Instead, he would defy the gods of war with a plan that echoed past glories, but carried the stench of decay. Gathered with his generals in the Reich Chancellery bunker, whose damp walls echoed the whispers of treachery, he outlined what would become known as Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Rhine Guard. But what guard was this? No longer the haughty sentinels of yesteryear, but ghosts of a dying empire, summoned for a final assault in the west. The objective was audacious, almost delirious, to penetrate the Allied lines in the Ardennes, a region of dense forests and treacherous hills in Belgium and Luxembourg, where the Americans maintained tenuous defenses, to advance like a sharp spear to the vital port of Antwerp, cutting Allied supply routes, separating Montgomery's and Bradley's armies, and forcing the West into a humiliating peace negotiation. With this, Hitler dreamed, Germany could turn its focus to the east, crush the Soviets, and rise from the ashes. It was the delusion of a compulsive gambler, betting not only his last coins, but the soul of an entire nation. The generals, men like Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, listened with pale faces, their eyes glazed with fatigue and veiled terror. Model, Hitler's fireman, who had contained disasters on previous fronts, saw madness in the plan. Fuel reserves were minimal, the weather unpredictable, and the Allies held absolute air superiority. Rundstedt, the Prussian veteran, murmured privately that it was an offensive with legs too short to reach the sea. But to dissent openly was to sign one's own death warrant. The Führer, with his feverish eyes and clenched fists, demanded blind obedience. Thus, the plan proceeded, shrouded in a veil of secrecy bordering on the supernatural. Orders were issued in whispers, documents burned after reading, and movements coordinated only under the veil of night. Panther and Tiger tanks, steel monsters with 88-meter cannons capable of piercing any Allied armor, were silently towed along muddy roads, their engines shut off on descents to avoid the betraying roar. Soldiers marched in ghostly columns, forbidden from lighting fires or cigarettes, shivering in the cold that penetrated bones and souls, with frosts that turned breaths into frozen clouds. Hundreds of thousands of men were mobilized, some 410,000 in total, divided into three armies: the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger. Among them were veterans of the Waffen-SS, hardened by the battles of Kursk and Normandy, whose scars told stories of past glories and unspeakable horrors. But mixed in with them were the boys of the Hitler Youth, teenagers of 16 or 17 years old, snatched from schools and farms, in baggy uniforms and wide eyes of lost innocence. They carried rusty Mauser rifles, grenades they barely knew how to handle, and an indoctrination that made them believe in miracles. But deep down, fear corroded them like acid. Families bid farewell in darkened stations, mothers weeping for sons they would never see again, fathers murmuring forbidden prayers in a nation that had banished God in favor of the Führer. Supplies were rationed to the extreme. Enough fuel for only 150 kilometers of advance, ammunition that would barely cover days of intense combat, and food consisting of moldy bread and watery soup. Yet the Nazi machine creaked for life, driven not by logic, but by a despair disguised as fierce determination. Deep within the Ardennes, forests where ancient pine trees stood like silent sentinels, the troops concentrated. Camouflaged with white nets and snowy branches, the panzer divisions waited, their cold guns pointed westward. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and the primal fear of men who knew they were marching towards the abyss. Rumors circulated in whispers that the Führer had promised secret weapons like the new Me-262 jets that would tear through the Allied skies, or King Tiger tanks that would crush Shermans like tin cans. But the reality was much darker. Many vehicles broke down along the way, abandoned by the side of frozen roads. Sick soldiers coughed up blood in makeshift camps, victims of pneumonia and malnutrition. Hitler, in his bubble of illusion, saw this as a divine sign. The Rhine, the mythical river of Germanic legend, would be defended not by warriors, but by vengeful ghosts. It was the last flame in the darkness, the final roar of a wounded lion, whose mouth foamed not with rage, but with terminal agony. And while the Allies slept in their positions, oblivious to the accumulating terror, a dying Germany prepared its coup. It was no longer a war of conquest. It was a fight for survival, tinged with existential terror. The Reich, once eternal, now counted its days like a condemned man on the scaffold. Hitler's despair infected everyone. Generals who dreamed of honorable suicide, soldiers who wrote final letters to loved ones, and a people who, in the ruins of their cities, looked to the night sky, fearing not only bombs, but the judgment of history. The offensive was not merely military, it was a primal cry against the void, a stubborn denial of inevitable collapse. And in a few hours, that cry would echo through the Ardennes, turning snow into blood and silence into eternal chaos. The last bet, the night hell, woke up. The night of December 15th, 1944, hung over the Ardennes like a black shroud, woven with frost and grim forebodings. The air was still, heavy, as if the atmosphere itself held its breath, awaiting the moment when the veil would be torn. In the dense forests, where intertwined branches formed natural cathedrals of darkness, American soldiers of the 106th and 99th Infantry Divisions huddled in shallow foxholes, wrapped in tattered blankets and fragmented dreams of distant homes. Many were rookies, young men from the American Midwest, whose hands trembled not only from the 10°C cold, but from the novelty of war. They had arrived. Recently, after rushed training in camps in Georgia or the Carolinas, where instructors shouted about tactics, but nothing prepared them for the icy emptiness of the front. Others, veterans of the battles in Sicily or Italy, were there for a well-deserved rest. The Ardennes sector was considered a ghost front, a quiet zone where the greatest enemy was boredom and hypothermia. They smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes, told jokes about girls back home, and gazed at the stars through low clouds, imagining that peace was just around the corner, beyond the snowy horizon. But oh, how deceptive was that calm! For beyond the trees, hidden in the twilight, the Third Reich had mustered its remaining fury. More than 200,000 soldiers, 400 tanks and armored vehicles, including the fearsome Panthers with their sloped armor, and Tigers with cannons that spat death for miles. Nearly 2,000 artillery pieces were positioned, loaded with the last reserves of ammunition, 190mm howitzers, Nebelwerfer, mortars that howled like banshees, and 80mm cannons that had shot down planes and tanks with equal ferocity. Hitler had ordered absolute secrecy, night movements under a veiled moon, white camouflage that blended men and machines into the snowy landscape, and strict radio bans to avoid detection. The weather conspired in their favor. Dense clouds and persistent fog blinded Allied reconnaissance planes, such as P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, which flew in vain over a harmless white carpet. Fuel. Depots were hidden in caves, ammunition piled under tarpaulins, and troops marched in sepulchral silence, their boots wrapped in rags to muffle their footsteps. The German commanders, Dietrich, with his SS brutality, and Manteuffel, with his tactical cunning, oversaw the build-up, knowing that success depended not on force, but on surprise. A surprise that smelled of desperation, like the last gasp of a cornered animal. In the German barracks, the air was thick with the stench of sweat, cheap tobacco, and suppressed fear. Veterans like those of the Panzer Lehr division, survivors of the carnage in Russia, sharpened bayonets with vacant stares, recalling comrades lost in the muddy ditches of Kursk or the burning streets of Kharkov. The young recruits, many from the Volkssturm, the people's militia of the elderly and teenagers, trembled not only from the cold, but from primal terror. Stories of summary executions for desertion circulated, and the Führer had promised victory or death. Families at home, in bombed villages like Aachen or Essen, sent tear-stained letters, pleading for returns that would never come. Fuel was so precious that tanks were towed by exhausted horses, and the daily ration barely sustained them. A piece of black bread, a slice of synthetic sausage, and ersatz coffee that tasted as bitter as bile. Yet, a spark of desperate hope fueled them. The irrational belief that this coup could reverse the course of the war, as in 1940, when the panzers crossed the Ardennes and humiliated France. But deep down, despair reigned. Generals whispered about the imminent end, soldiers dreamed of surrender, and the night air seemed heavy with the ghosts of the millions already fallen. Then, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the primordial silence was shattered. It was a moment of absolute stillness at first, the kind of silence that precedes cataclysms, where even the wind seems to pause, and men's hearts race with instinctive panic. And then, hell awoke. More than 100 German cannons roared in unison, an artillery barrage, echoing the horrors of Verdun in 1916, or the initial bombardment of Stalingrad in 1942. The night sky lit up with orange flashes, as if the firmament were tearing apart. Successive explosions shook the earth, creating artificial earthquakes that felled centuries-old trees, their roots rising like dead claws. Men were vaporized in the initial impacts, bodies disintegrated into red mist, pulverized bones mingling with the falling snow in flakes now tinged with soot and blood. The 106th Division, positioned in the center of the assault, suffered the worst. Entire bunkers were obliterated, transformed into smoking craters, where moments before soldiers had played cards or written letters home. The pure snow turned into a pink swamp, then crimson, then black with entrails and debris. Allied communications collapsed instantly, telephone wires severed by shrapnel, radios silenced by the chaos, commanders shouting orders to units that no longer existed. Gunpowder haze mingled with the morning mist, creating a suffocating curtain that smelled of demonic sulfur, burnt flesh, and damp terror. American soldiers, awakened from their slumber, emerged from shelters trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. Where did that come from? Wasn't the war ending? But there was no time for questions, only the primal instinct to survive. The artillery fire didn't cease. Waves of shells struck retreat roads, exploding supply trucks in fireballs that illuminated the false dawn. Ammunition depots detonated in chains of secondary explosions, sending lethal shrapnel like deadly rain. Command posts were pulverized, leaving leaders isolated in a sea of panic. When the dam subsided slightly, the monsters emerged from the shadows, from the forests shrouded in camouflage uniforms that made them look like snow specters. Advanced the German vanguard, SS infantry with MG-42 machine guns spitting out 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like the buzzing of infernal bees that mowed down entire ranks. Stick grenades exploding in muffled thunder, tearing limbs and dreams. Panther tanks roaring ahead, crushing barbed wire fences, farm sheds, and fallen bodies beneath tracks that creaked like breaking bones. Village houses like those in Saint-Vith or Bastogne imploded with civilian families and soldiers inside, screams echoing briefly before being engulfed by the roar. The ground vibrated as if the earth were alive and hungry, a primordial giant awakening to devour the intruders. Surviving witnesses would later describe it as, "It wasn't war. It was the apocalypse descending from the trees with the smell of death and the sound of the end of the world." For the Americans, especially the newcomers, the terror was palpable, a despair that gnawed at the soul. Why was Germany still fighting with such ferocity? Where did these demons come from? How had no one foreseen this madness? Many froze in place, paralyzed by dread, while others ran in blind panic, slipping on the bloody snow, abandoning rifles and comrades. Entire units surrendered en masse. More than 7,500 of the 106th Division captured in the first few days, marching into captivity with empty, hopeless stares. The air filled with screams in English and German, mingled with the crackling of flames and the groans of the wounded pleading for mercy in incomprehensible languages. The forest, once asleep and peaceful, revealed itself to be a labyrinth of horrors. Ambushes, in clearings, S-mines that exploded legs, and snipers who reaped the lives of unseen shadows. This offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein by the Germans, was given by the Allies a name that encapsulated its terror, the Battle of the Bulge, referring to the bulge or protuberance that the German advance created on the map, like a swollen wound on the Western Front. In minutes, the calm evaporated, replaced by a red and white chaos, snow and blood intertwined in a carpet of desolation. German despair, born from the agony of a dying regime, now infected the Allies. Commanders like Eisenhower rushed to reorganize, but the initial panic claimed lives and morale. Soldiers trembled not only from the cold, but from an existential terror that the war, thought to be over, was reborn, more ferocious, more desperate, more terrifying. And as the day dawned over smoking craters, the white world of the Ardennes transformed into an eternal hell, where hope was a forgotten luxury, and the only companion was the specter of death, whispering promises of oblivion. American soldiers caught sleeping, shock, panic, and blood on the ice. American soldiers caught sleeping, shock, panic, and blood on the ice. Extended, brutal, and historically accurate version. The German attack began before dawn, at that treacherous time when the human body is most vulnerable. Most of the American soldiers hadn't moved a muscle since collapsing, exhausted, onto the frozen canvas to sleep. They believed they were safe, that the war in those snow-covered mountains was merely a long wait for the inevitable end of the conflict. Then, without warning, came the first wave of death. German artillery barrages exploded like subterranean thunder, shaking the frozen earth, uprooting entire trees, and turning shallow trenches into instant graves. 1 second, men were asleep. The next, they were hurled into the air like rag dolls or buried under layers of earth, snow, and splintered wood. Many didn't even get to open their eyes. Those who awoke did so confused, dazed, their hearts pounding in their chests, unable to tell if it was a nightmare or reality. The explosions made the ground vibrate beneath their bodies, and the air filled with the suffocating smell of gunpowder and burnt mud. Some stumbled as they tried to put on their boots, others blindly donning their helmets while searching for their weapons with numb fingers. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived at the front, was the first to feel the full impact of the attack. They had no real combat experience. They had been sent there to a supposedly quiet zone, to learn while observing. The position they occupied was long, stretched too far to be protected, with few tanks, little ammunition, and almost no anti-armor defenses. It was an open invitation to destruction, and the Germans accepted it violently. While the artillery continued to grind the ground, the gunfire echoed like bursts of steel cutting through the air. Men ran, disoriented through the newly kicked snow, which turned into clouds of white dust and ice. With each step, they sank up to their shins, slipped and fell. The cold bit into their exposed skin like glass teeth. The dry air cut their throats like invisible blades, and mixed with the cold came a terror so intense that it made their hands tremble even under thick gloves. Further south, the veterans of the 28th Division, men who had already survived the inescapable hell of the Hurtgen forest, knew exactly what they were hearing. And many simply collapsed mentally. They had spent weeks in that dark forest, facing mud, ambushes, and relentless artillery fire. The exhaustion was so profound that some soldiers, upon hearing the first explosions, went into shock. They stood motionless, unable to rise, staring into the void as death surrounded them once more. Then came the Germans. They emerged from the morning mist, like specters walking from within the forest. They wore white camouflage cloaks, which made them appear part of the snow. To the hastily awakened Americans, it seemed as if the landscape itself had risen to attack. When they opened fire, the effect was devastating. The MG-42, the machine gun that soldiers called Hitler's saw, ripped through the air with bursts so rapid they sounded like a single prolonged sound. Men fell in succession without even completing the movement of raising their rifles. Fresh blood splattered the ground, vaporizing in the cold air before, mingling with the overwhelming white of the snow. Communication attempts died almost immediately. Telephone cables had been ripped from the ground by the explosions. Radios shattered, burned by shrapnel or crushed by fallen trees. Messengers ran towards the rear, carrying folded notes or desperate pleas for reinforcements, only to be shot down hundreds of meters away by sniper fire from hidden areas. The Sherman tanks that could have transformed the field into a defensive barrier were too far away, stuck on narrow, slippery roads, still believing that morning would be calm. When they finally understood the scale of the attack, it was already too late for many on the front line. Witnesses later recounted that the entire camp resembled a living nightmare, where men shouted orders and cries for help while simultaneously trying to move in formation. They saw dead or mutilated comrades scattered like torn sacks, and yet they brandished their weapons, attempting to resist even when they knew it was futile. Small groups of soldiers, lost amidst the storm of steel, did their best to hold the line. They fired bullet after bullet until their fingers were purple and numb. They detonated their last grenades. But there weren't enough numbers, nor enough weapons. It was like trying to stop an avalanche with their bare hands. Within hours, entire positions vanished. They weren't just defeated, they were obliterated. And then, above all that chaos, echoed a sound that chilled even the most hardened veteran. The deep, steady roar of engines, Panzerkampfwagen and Tigers, heavy armored vehicles, advancing like steel monsters, devouring roads, forests, and trenches. At that moment, the American soldiers understood something terrible and clear as ice breaking beneath their feet. The war was far from over. Germany, which many believed to be on its knees, had risen to fight with everything it had left. And on that freezing morning in Belgium, the United States discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that nothing was guaranteed. Not victory, not survival. Blitzkrieg in the snow, the steel ghosts of the Ardennes. Extended version for narrative. When the bombardment finally subsided, and the echo of the explosions faded among the frozen tree trunks, an eerie silence fell over the field. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but rather the harbinger of something even worse. The American soldiers had barely grasped what was happening when they heard a new sound coming from afar. First it was just a metallic whisper, like chains dragging on ice. Then it became a deep, resonant rumble, vibrating in the ground. The men felt the earth tremble beneath their boots, and that's when they realized. Those were engines. Many engines. The forest, which until then seemed to be racing against time, opened up as if releasing hidden monsters. From the midst of the trees emerged German tanks, advancing as if they were part of the snow itself. From the thick fog and the bitter smoke of gunpowder, dark silhouettes began to appear, then clear shapes, and finally the long, cold steel guns. First came the Panzer IVs, medium and fast, moving along narrow tracks as if navigating avenues. Soon after came the Panthers, whose sloped armor had been feared since 1943. And then, breaking branches and throwing snow in all directions, appeared the giants that would make any soldier tremble. The Tiger, the WW and Tiger II, machines so heavy and enormous that they seemed impossible to stop. The Americans knew those tanks shouldn't be there. The Ardennes wasn't armored terrain. The roads were too narrow, the frozen mud treacherous, and the dense forests prevented any rapid advance. But the Germans had prepared everything in silence and in the dark. The routes had been studied, the troops had been camouflaged, and now, with time on their side and total surprise, they were coming at speed, crushing military logic with the brutal practice of warfare. The initial American reaction was one of absolute shock. Machine guns attempted to open fire, but many of the soldiers operating them were too young to have faced armored vehicles before. The shots hit the sides of the tanks and ricocheted as if they were hitting rocks. Bazookas were fired, but many missed due to human error, stress, or simply technical incompetence. Some hit their targets, but without the correct angle or distance, they left only marks on the paint. There were cases where American troops watched helplessly as their own ammunition exploded without penetrating the thick armor of the Tiger tanks. The Shermans, which could have offered some resistance, were scattered far behind the initial line, parked on snow-covered roads. By the time they managed to advance, many were already too late. The first clashes between American tanks and German armored vehicles were almost always one-sided. A Tiger would fire its 88mm cannon, and a Sherman would simply disappear in a cloud of black smoke. Some exploded so violently that the turret was torn off, spinning in the air like an iron lid thrown by a giant. In many cases, the men inside the tank had no chance of escape. They died burned, suffocated by smoke, or shattered by the impact of the explosion. Further south, American trucks attempted to retreat along narrow roads, but encountered roadblocks, destroyed vehicles, and desperate troops trying to escape. The snow was so deep that even running was difficult. Many trucks skidded, slid, and became bogged down, turning into metal prisons for the soldiers on board. Medics tried to help the wounded, dragging bodies and placing them on makeshift stretchers, but were surprised by the enemy advance or the sudden arrival of German panzer grenadiers who swept the area with machine gun fire. In the villages of the Ardennes, Belgian civilians watched in horror. Some opened doors and windows, shouting for lost soldiers to come in and hide. Entire families sheltered soldiers who had become separated from their units, offering them hot coffee and blankets, unaware that they were bringing the war into their homes. When the German columns arrived, these same houses were hit indiscriminately. Entire walls collapsed, children ran to the basements, and wounded soldiers were dragged away amidst the chaos. For 3 days, the German advance seemed unstoppable. American units retreated relentlessly, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and entire vehicles. In certain stretches, entire battalions surrendered without even firing a shot. The map showing the American lines began to fold inward as if being pushed with a fist. Hence the name that would mark history, a swelling, a deep push on the front, a deadly bulge, the Battle of the Bulge. For many Americans, it was like reliving the stories of 1940, when Germany seemed invincible and the Blitzkrieg smashed everything in its path. In that early December of 1944, it seemed as if the past was returning in full force. But behind the fear and deadly precision of the advance, there was a secret that few yet perceived. That brilliant attack was being carried out with limited fuel and rationed ammunition. Germany was betting everything it had left. And as their tanks advanced through the thick snow, a town surrounded by forests began to become a permanent name in the history of the war, Bastogne. The attack began before many American soldiers had even opened their eyes. In the shallow, poorly constructed trenches, men awoke not to clarinets or trumpets, but to the roar of explosions tearing the ground beneath their bodies. Some jumped up, dazed, still half caught in their dream, searching for their boots, their weapons, trying to understand what was happening. Others, they never woke up again, buried under artillery barrages that crushed their makeshift huts. 106th Infantry Division, the newly arrived unit, lacking any real combat experience, was nearly swallowed whole. It occupied a vulnerable salient on the front line, a position that was too extended, too narrow, with few armored vehicles and almost no anti-tank defenses. He was the perfect target for a devastating blow. The soldiers ran disoriented through the deep snow, sinking up to their shins, each step as heavy as dragging an iron ball. The air was so cold it burned my lungs when I inhaled. Their hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the absolute terror of facing something they couldn't see clearly. Meanwhile, further east, positions of 28th. Division veteran but exhausted, they too fell under attack. They had already fought in Hurtgen Forest, a nightmare that killed thousands over endless weeks. There, the survivors were mentally broken, and many simply, they couldn't bear the thought of another hell. The Germans appeared in the clearings like nightmarish figures, silent, organized in rows, wearing white cloaks that transformed them into walking shadows. For Americans, it seemed as if the snow itself had decided to kill. The first enemy machine guns shattered the remaining silence. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, MG-42 crushing the world, 200 shots per minute, men falling like rag dolls. Blood splattered on the white, forming dark stains that steamed in the cold. Many soldiers didn't even have time to find cover and died with their rifles pressed against their chests without firing. Broken communications, radios were destroyed by the initial explosions. Cable after cable cut. Messengers attempting to run were shot before they could travel 100 meters. Armored vehicles that never arrived, American Shermans, who could have helped, were miles behind, stuck on icy roads, still believing that this morning would be just another routine day. Screams carried away by the wind witnesses would later recount that panic took hold within minutes. We are surrounded. Where do they come from? Retreat, retreat. Shouts mixed with confused orders and the cries of boys who had never seen anyone die so quickly. Some small detachments tried to resist. They fired, reloaded with trembling hands, and burned their last grenades. But they were water droplets trying to hold back a flood. In just hours, entire American positions were wiped off the map, captured, destroyed, or forced to retreat in disarray. And in the distance, an even more terrifying sound emerged, or the deep rumble of tank engines, a deep vibration, as if giants were walking beneath the ground. The Germans, whom the Americans believed to be defeated, were there, en masse, furious, determined, and dangerously alive. And for many American soldiers on that freezing morning, a terrible, slow truth began to take shape in their hearts. They were not winning the war. Not there, not that day. The Germans advanced like an unstoppable wave. Tanks, infantry, and snow swallowing everything. The cold morning sun barely had the strength to pierce the heavy clouds when the true power of the German attack was revealed. The initial bombing had been merely the blow that broke down the door. Now, what was coming was an invasion of the entire house. From the dense, silent forest emerged dark masses of armored vehicles, their tracks crushing snow, tree trunks, and bodies indiscriminately. Tigers, panthers, and the enormous jagged panthers, steel monsters with armor thick enough to ignore most American small arms. The American soldiers who survived the initial attack watched, paralyzed for what felt like an eternity, as these war machines advanced with predatory calm, as if they knew they had already won before even firing a shot. The German infantry marched alongside them, swift and precise, each movement rehearsed with the brutal discipline that characterized the Reich Army. Robbers armed with Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles, a design so advanced it seemed to come from the future, exchanged gunfire with American rifles that often jammed in the freezing cold. In some areas, isolated groups of American soldiers were attempting to form makeshift lines of defense. They were men with faces weathered by the wind, eyes wide with fear, unable to believe that this gigantic offensive was real. They fired from what remained of the trenches, hid behind broken trees, and formed barricades with bodies, both living and dead, because there wasn't enough wood or sandbags, but it was like trying to cross an overflowing river using only a bucket. The Germans advanced without stopping. When they encountered resistance, they crushed it with concentrated fire, accompanying artillery and automatically launched grenades. When they couldn't find it, they simply kept going, fast, determined, consuming ground every minute. For Americans, the horror lay in realizing that it wasn't just a frontal attack. Observers soon discovered that the Germans had sent rapid units, panzer grenadiers and motorized troops, outlining flanks, cutting roads, planting explosives on bridges, and infiltrating trails that no one believed were viable in winter. They were shadows moving along, covered paths appearing where they should never be. Entire columns of vehicles passed unnoticed through the fog and snow. They were elite battalions infiltrating the villages of the region, clearing every house, every barn, every street, leaving behind absolute silence. An American division reported something that was repeated across the board. They weren't just being pushed. They were being cut up, fragmented, divided into small human islands, unable to help each other. The officers shouted, orders that no longer made sense. Hold the line. Wait for reinforcements. But there was no line to hold, and no reinforcements would arrive anytime soon. The German army seemed to have awakened from a deep coma with renewed strength and terrifying savagery. It was the Reich's last gamble, the last flame before the darkness, and they were prepared to burn it all down. When night fell again, and the cold froze, the blood splattered on the ground, turning it into dark ice, a brutal truth hung over the battlefield. The Americans were no longer just being attacked, they were being hunted, and the next day promised to be even worse. Roads blocked, columns trapped, and chaos in the darkness. The German advance cuts vital veins of the Allies. In theory, the Americans could still retreat and reorganize a line of defense. In practice, this became almost impossible within hours. The roads, those narrow arteries that crisscrossed the dense Ardennes forest, were few, winding, poorly maintained, and have now become the scene of a nightmare. As the Germans advanced, they quickly seized key intersections. Motorized reconnaissance troops and armed motorcyclists surged ahead of the tank columns and began cutting off routes even before American orders reached the drivers. Convoys loaded with ammunition, fuel and food suddenly found themselves stopped, unsure whether it was safe to advance or retreat. Trucks formed lines that snaked for miles. Men ran, trying to understand what was happening, while officers attempted to impose order on a situation that was completely out of control. The snow only made things worse. She was hiding mines. She swallowed wheels and boots. She turned any attempt at maneuvering into an exercise in desperation. And as if they were ghosts emerging from the white sky, the German ambush teams attacked these stationary columns. Grenades thrown at fuel trucks turned entire vehicles into fireballs that exploded in mid-air. MG-42 machine guns cut through lines of men trying to escape burning trucks. Some desperate drivers tried to push vehicles onto the shoulder, but the ice caused tires to spin uncontrollably, throwing trucks and jeeps against trees or against each other. There were reports of soldiers hearing gunfire coming from all directions, but being unable to identify its source. The echo between the mountains made it seem as if the enemy was everywhere at once. And in that labyrinth of ice and smoke, something even more frightening began to emerge. Stories of German patrols dressed in American uniforms, speaking enough English to fool checkpoints. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. These men were part of Operation Grief, led by Otto Skorzeny, the saboteur unit whose mission was to sow total chaos. And it worked. Command posts were receiving conflicting information. Roads that should have been clear were blocked. Bridges that still existed disappeared under explosions minutes later. The US Army, so accustomed to operating with overwhelming logistical superiority, found itself, for the first time since D-Day, unable to safely move men, ammunition, or tanks. And as communications crumbled and the front folded in on itself, the darkness of night fell over the Ardennes like an iron curtain, a thick, moonless darkness where even the silence seemed to have teeth. Inside, entire columns were trapped and isolated. Lost platoons wandered around searching for other units and ended up running into German patrols. Officials were planning retreats that no longer existed on the real map. And then, a suffocating feeling settled among the American soldiers, the sensation that they were being swallowed up, piece by piece, like small prey under the paw of a gigantic predator. While the German engines continued to roar in the distance and the snow fell silently, it became clear that something terrible was brewing, and that no one, absolutely no one, knew exactly the size of that steel storm coming from the east. Bastogne becomes the heart of the resistance, and Germany's most coveted target. Amidst all the chaos, one point on the map began to shine, not as hope, but like a lit match in a powder keg, the small town of Bastogne. For Americans, it was a vital crossroads. For the Germans, it was the key that would open the doors to the Meuse River, and if luck was on their side, to the full resumption of the war in the West. It was an insignificant piece of land to any unsuspecting eye. Simple little houses, narrow streets, the smell of burning firewood and snow piled up on the rooftops. But strategically, it was a tight knot between 7 roads, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the fate of the entire offensive. And while the American lines were breaking apart like thin ice, one unit in particular marched to occupy that critical position, a 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles. They didn't arrive flying. There were no parachutes that night. They were sent by truck in the early morning, crossing clogged, snow-covered roads, many still recovering from the ferocity of combat in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. They arrived exhausted, poorly equipped, with soldiers wearing makeshift blankets, scarves made from blankets cut with knives, and many without boots suitable for temperatures that caused frostbite within a few hours. And they had no rest, because while they were walking through the narrow streets of Bastogne, carrying rifles, ammunition, and fear in the same backpack, the Germans were already building a ring of steel around the city. Panzer grenadiers, heavy infantry, and armored vehicles positioned themselves in a growing, deadly circle, preparing to tighten their grip and crush the city like a fist closes on a fragile object. The first skirmishes began almost immediately. American patrols that advanced a few meters outside the city were met with gunfire coming from the tree line. The fog caused the enemy to multiply. A platoon, running between fences and houses, could be taken down before reaching the end of the street. And then came the cruelest moment of all, the realization that Bastogne was not only being surrounded, it was already isolated. Roads are closed, columns destroyed or diverted, reinforcements that would never arrive in time. When maps and reports finally reached the Allied commanders, one word carried more weight than any bullet: enclosed. Within the city, there was something between 18 and 20,000. The 101st and its attached units, engineers, artillerymen, medics, against a much larger German force, supported by heavy tanks and seemingly endless reserves. And the cold, the silent enemy that never sleeps, continued to fall upon everything, covering corpses, erasing tracks, freezing fingers, stealing strength. With the city blockaded and the German artillery adjusting its fire meter by meter, every man there became aware of something terrible. They weren't just fighting. They were prisoners, maintaining a position that perhaps wasn't even possible to hold. But if Bastogne fell, the entire front would fall. And so, in that suffocating ring of snow and steel, the most desperate battle of the German offensive was about to erupt. and the story of the 101st Division would enter eternity. Hungry, frozen, and without medicine, Bastogne sinks into utter suffering. With Bastogne surrounded, hell ceased to be a metaphor and became a physical and palpable reality. The city, small and harmless, before the German offensive, was transformed into a prison without walls. The men of the 101st Division and its attached units entered, believing they would mount a temporary defense until reinforcements arrived. But when the siege was complete, they realized they would have to survive. Days, perhaps weeks, without enough food, without fuel, without medical supplies, and without even adequate clothing for the deadly cold. Winter struck mercilessly. Temperatures plummeted to levels that turned the air into smoke when you breathed it. Wait a few minutes without moving, and the cold seemed to seep under your skin, burning muscles and swelling fingers until they stiffened. Frostbite became as common as bullets. Soldiers woke up unable to feel their feet, and some discovered that their skin was beginning to necrotize, death entering through their footwear even before the war reached them. The food disappeared first. Rations were cut in half, then into quarters, then counted one by one. Men shared crumbs, scraped metal pans for dried grease, melted snow to drink, and swallowed anything hot, even when it tasted of mud or rust. The fuel ran out soon after. Without gasoline for their vehicles, the Americans watched their own tanks and trucks freeze in place, turning into static fortresses or, worse, enormous inert blocks of metal, useless against the advancing enemy. Without fuel, there was no heating either, which made the nights endless. Many soldiers huddled together inside barns or ruins to share body heat. Some survived because they slept embracing each other, despite shame, fear, or pride. They knew that, in the end, freezing to death was worse than any embarrassment. But nothing was as devastating as the collapse of medical supplies. Makeshift hospitals sprang up in attics, basements, windowless buildings, and churches destroyed by artillery fire. Doctors and nurses worked with hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Without sufficient anesthesia, amputations were performed with soldiers biting down on leather straps, trying not to scream as sores cut through bones and the pain exploded like pure fire. Without antibiotics, simple wounds became slow death sentences, and without bandages, torn clothes, dirty towels, even pieces of blankets became makeshift dressings. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. The snow concealed the bodies of friends, comrades, brothers in arms. Some were left where they fell, marked only by their helmet turned upwards or by the rifle stuck in the frozen ground. The priority was to survive another day. And amidst this physical suffering, there was also psychological suffering. The siege was so tight that no one knew when or with the Allied army would arrive. Each night seemed like the prelude to total annihilation. Each sunrise brought the same suffocating fear. Will Bastogne fall today? Even weakened by cold, hunger, and fear, those men continued fighting, guarding positions on the edge of the city, engaging in short, violent skirmishes with German patrols that constantly tested the perimeter. Because, despite everything, a cruel and simple truth had settled in the heart of every man imprisoned in that city. If Bastogne fell, the war would last much longer, and perhaps none of them would return home. The German ultimatum, surrender or die, and the response that went down in history. On the day, December 22nd, 1944, when Bastogne seemed on the verge of collapse, the enemy decided to try a different approach than simple massacre. The German forces surrounding the city believed the Americans were on the verge of collapse, and, confident of this, sent messengers under a white flag with a formal message. They were carrying a written ultimatum addressed to the American commander in Bastogne, general name Anthony McAuliffe. He was polite, almost courteous, but with sharp teeth. In essence, it said, "American troops are surrounded. There is no hope of relief. If they do not surrender, Immediately, Bastogne will be destroyed by heavy artillery, and all those inside will be annihilated. It was the kind of statement that at any other time in history would have given commanders pause for thought. Inside the city, soldiers were freezing, supplies were running low, and German artillery made the earth tremble day and night. It seemed, in fact, that there was no escape. McAuliffe received the document inside a building requisitioned as headquarters. I was tired, had slept poorly, and was irritated by the situation. When his officers explained the contents to him, he exploded with the most spontaneous reaction possible, spitting it out almost without thinking. Nuts! The word, a mixture of sarcasm, anger, and disbelief, sounded strange. But it perfectly expressed what he felt. The Americans would not surrender. Not there, not that day, and definitely not for the last desperate gasp of the Nazi army. The officers laughed, half in disbelief. Then, when asked what the formal response to the Germans should be, McAuliffe repeated, "Just write this, N-U-T-S, nuts." And so it was done. When the messenger returned to the German line carrying the paper with the reply, the enemy officers were confused. They didn't know what the word meant. Some thought it was a code. Others thought it was a serious insult. Finally, a captured American officer explained the exact meaning. It means something like, "Go to hell," or "Go to hell." The message spread through the city. Like an emotional fuse. Men who had barely been able to stand because of the cold smiled for the first time in days. Soldiers, feeling they were going to freeze to death, raised trembling fists. The 101st Division, nearly out of ammunition, with hunger gnawing at their stomachs and the enemy like a wall surrounding them, found in the word Nuts a spark of fury. They wouldn't give in. They wouldn't fall to their knees. On one side in the snow was Germany, betting everything. On the other side, in ruins, was Bastogne, a small town sustained by men who simply refused to give up, no matter the cost. And at that moment, it became clear to both sides, the battle was far from over, and it would only get bloodier. The sky opens up, and destiny changes with the roar of the engines. For almost a week, Bastogne lived like a place forgotten by God. The snow fell without stopping, chilling bones and extinguishing hope. The 101st Airborne Division, and the fragments of units that joined it, was trapped inside a German iron ring, without enough food, without medicine, with ammunition counted cartridge by cartridge. Wounded men groaned inside makeshift cellars, wrapped in dirty blankets, trying not to think about the cold seeping into their limbs. Some bid farewell to life silently, without drama, simply by ceasing to wake up. But the worst enemy wasn't just the German army. It was the weather. Overcast skies, dense clouds hanging like an iron ceiling. Allied planes that could have rescued Bastogne were trapped at their bases in England and France, blinded by the storm. To those soldiers, it seemed as if the whole world had abandoned Bastogne. Until at dawn of December 23rd, 1944, something impossible happened. The wind has changed. First came a light, sharp but different breeze, as if the air were moving for the first time in weeks. Then the sky, once grey and solid, began to open up in irregular cracks. A soldier later described it. It was as if someone had torn the sky, open with an invisible knife. Through the cracks, timid streaks of blue emerged, and when the sun finally broke through the clouds, all the snow seemed to sparkle, as if the world were broken glass scattered on the ground. The men looked up, incredulous. Some cried, others laughed, and many stood motionless, their eyes filled with tears, because they knew what that meant. In the distant horizon, the air began to tremble. First a low hum, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Then a growing, a roar, engine after engine, training after training. A metallic swarm emerging in the clear sky. And then they appeared, C-47 Dakota Grey wings reflecting the light, coming in an orderly line. Behind them, squadrons of fighter jets, P-47, Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, ready to sweep the sky and ground of any enemy who dared to move. Inside the C-47s, boxes marked with black ink, ammunition, morphine belongings, animal feed, radio batteries, and notes written by women's hands in American factories saying, "Don't give up." The planes opened their metal bellies, and Bastogne was covered by hundreds of parachutes, white, green, striped, descending slowly like grotesque flowers in winter. The Germans tried to shoot some down with anti-aircraft machine guns, but the numbers were overwhelming. The American soldiers rushed to retrieve the containers before they even touched the ground. Some celebrated by lifting heavy boxes above their heads. Others embraced ammunition as one embraces family. Within minutes, the besieged city ceased to be a tomb with no way out. The ice had broken. What came next was even more devastating for the enemy. Now that the weather was clear, what remained of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, attempted to attack Bastogne and its air routes. But they were a shadow of what they once were. Few planes, exhausted pilots, scarce fuel. American fighter jets, on the other hand, painted the sky with white trails. They bombarded columns of German tanks and trucks trying to reach the front. Entire roads have become cemeteries of twisted metal. As evening fell, the German soldiers surrounding Bastogne began to understand the disaster. They were no longer strangling the city. They were being crushed by the weight of the air above. That day, the men who were surrounded realized something important. They could die there, but they would not die alone. And especially, they would not die without a fight. The bridge that became a death sentence, men crushed between steel, fire, and ice. When the German advance finally encountered roads not blocked by trees, craters, and destroyed pillars, the attack gained deadly momentum. Panzer IV tanks, Panthers, and the monstrous King Tigers advanced like hungry predators, tearing their way through the Ardennes with roaring engines and cannons spitting fire. Ahead of them lay a critical obstacle, a narrow bridge over the Ourthe River, one of the few crossings still standing. If the Americans destroyed it, entire German contingents could be trapped and delayed for hours or days. If it fell into enemy hands intact, it could become the perfect corridor for launching tanks directly into the heart of the Allied lines. The initial reports arrived late, but by the time the American High Command realized what was at stake, it was too late to plan something elegant. The bridge needed to be held, no matter the cost. Remaining companies of the 112th Infantry were hastily pushed into position. Men who hadn't slept for 2 days, who had retreated under constant fire, whose hands were purple with cold, were ordered to rush to the structure and dig defensive holes in the frozen ground. There was no time for trenches. Shovels pounded on ice and resonated like iron against iron. Some used bayonets to dig, others simply piled up bags of frozen sand, improvising barricades that wouldn't stop a tank, but might hold back the infantry. The first German shots echoed through the valley like compressed thunder. Snipers, hidden among the white trees, began to cut down men on the riverbanks. Every American soldier who tried to move to reinforce the defense could feel the invisible scroll cutting through the air, death buzzing inches from their face. The artillery fell soon after. The Germans knew the Americans would fight to the death to hold that passage and decided to sweep the terrain before attempting to cross it. The ground trembled, the bridge shook, beams cracked like bones breaking. The icy water below exploded in luminous columns each time a projectile plunged down, raising freezing spray that turned into needles in the air. The defenders cowered, clutching their rifles and trying to remember that they were still alive. When the tanks finally appeared, they emerged from the fog like steel specters. A Panther rolled to the beginning of the bridge, its cannon pointed at the makeshift fortification. The Americans fired bazookas, but the warheads ricocheted uselessly against the frontal armor. The tank's response was a single shot, which blew up an entire machine gun station, sending men and sandbags flying through the air. The bridge has become a death corridor. Soldiers tried to run across, carrying ammunition to the opposite side, but were reduced to pieces by MG-42 machine guns positioned in the German rear. Each falling body was quickly covered in red snow that evaporated into hot steam before freezing. Some tried to retreat by swimming across the river, but the water was so icy, it took the air out of their chests in seconds. Many disappeared there, swallowed by the dark current. Later accounts would tell of a small group that refused to abandon their position, even after everyone around them was dead or wounded. 3 or 4 men, perhaps 5, no one can confirm. They continued firing, even with their ammunition running out, even coughing up blood, even when the bridge was already trembling under the inevitable weight of the enemy armored vehicles. The American command finally ordered the abandonment of the position and the destruction of the crossing, but orders on the radio mean little when no one is left to hear them. The bridge only collapsed when the Germans were already crossing, when the charges detonated belatedly, and the final roar came along with the sound of tanks plunging into the river. Half crossed, half sank. Victory and tragedy mingled in equal proportions. For the Americans fleeing through the surrounding forest, the sound was forever, etched in their memory, the deep crack of the wood giving way, the twisting of the iron, and the muffled cries of men who had no choice but to die to delay the enemy for a few minutes, perhaps an hour. And on that frigid morning, watching the smoke rise from the destroyed bridge, many soldiers understood something brutal. The Battle of the Bulge would be decided by inches of ground, by stolen minutes, and by the complete sacrifice of men who would never see the end of the road they helped build. Every meter defended would cost blood, and nobody knew how many meters were still left. The American retreat through the Ardennes was not an escape, but a slow and agonizing march along narrow, frozen roads that became deadly traps. German patrols emerged from the snow, ambushed and disappeared, while a single destroyed truck paralyzed the entire column. Vehicles burned, soldiers froze to death, and chaos spread amidst lost orders and rumors of executions. Groups tried to resist using wreckage as barricades, but ended up isolated in the forest. The road became a trail of charred metal, bodies buried under ice, and comrades helping each other to avoid succumbing. When they reached new defensive lines, they were exhausted and traumatized, and the battle was not yet over. Only when the weather cleared and Allied planes came into action did the tide finally turn, sealing the defeat of the German offensive. For those who marched that road, the white hell never ended, even after victory.